Good afternoon. I'm Brett Kirkpatrick, Director of the Moody Medical Library, and I'm very pleased to welcome you to a rare look at the Blocker History of Medicine collections. Our speaker is Howard Rutenberg, President of B&L Rutenberg Rare Books. This is a family-owned business that's been serving collectors and libraries since 1970. Howard holds a Juris Doctorate from Loyola University, has practiced law in Los Angeles, and he's had academic preparation in rare books from the University of Virginia at Charlottesville. He's here working with us to establish a current valuation for the Blocker collections, rare books, and he's previously appraised the volumes donated to the collection by the Moody Foundation, a significant gift for which we are all very grateful. Howard clearly loves what he does, and his enthusiasm for rare books, I think you'll find, is infectious. Please welcome Howard Rutenberg.
Thank you very much. It is a pleasure to be here in Galveston and to be working in the Blocker History of Medicine collection. You know, last time I was here, when I was doing the Moody appraisal, I had a chance to speak to a small group of people in the library, and I guess I was so enthusiastic that they asked me to come back and say a few words, so here I am. I'd like to discuss a dilemma that I have in coming to UTMB. It's more a frustration as opposed to a dilemma, but a dilemma nonetheless, and it's not just getting here from Los Angeles, which in and of itself is a challenge. It's really a dilemma that can only be understood by my telling you a little bit about what I do, about my job. When somebody asks me about my job, I say, I buy and sell rare books. Well, most people are a bit surprised because they've never heard of that job, and if they've even heard of rare books, they didn't know that anybody could actually make a living out of it. Nowadays, of course, people might think books in general are becoming a rare thing. I mean, you know, you can download a complete first-run novel to your Kindle or to your computer, and so books might certainly just be, you know, on the way out. But what I do is explain to them that there are collectors, like people that like collect, you know, comic books or baseball cards or oil paintings from Renaissance masters. They collect books. Both private individual collectors and institutions like museums and university special collections are counted as customers. The great thing about my job is that on a day-to-day basis, I deal with people, either the collectors, the librarians, my colleagues, who are knowledgeable, especially about the subjects that they're interested in, and who are passionate about books and manuscripts. It's interesting because I know a lot about books, but less about the subjects that the collectors are expert on. So I'm in a very unique position to have a job where I learn something new every day, and it's just a wonderful thing. So my job is really to get to know my customers' collections. So then I'm out in the market looking for books, and I buy books that I like, knowing that if I really like it, then somebody else, especially somebody that knows about the subject, is really going to like it. So I travel all over the world. I go to book fairs, I go to auctions, I go to bookstores. It's a tough job, yeah. Yeah. Now I was a lawyer, remember. So, yes, do I miss the law? No. Okay, my specialty is and has been the history of science, medicine, and natural history. So I'm not really a collector myself, so there's no real potential conflict of interest. I buy material for inventory, and then, as I say, I figure if I like it, somebody else will truly like it. For me, the thrill is in the chase. It's getting something, figuring out what it is, and then selling it, because tomorrow something new is going to come around. And it's very interesting because I buy books that are sometimes 500 years old, and it's true, you can actually sometimes tell who owned it by the annotations, by the book plates. It's like detective work, and that's part of what we do, is being a detective, trying to figure out who owned the book. I did actually start a couple collections because I felt, I was never a collector. I always like things very neat. A lot of people, keep things from their childhood, and I'm more of like, let's get it out and keep the place neat. But I did want to get a feel for the mind of the collector. So I started a couple of collections in the past 19 years. One of which is I collect for myself medical sheet music. Now, medical sheet music, like the X-ray waltz, or the microbe two-step, or I Want to Marry a Doctor. It's really great because, you can go into any used bookstore in the country and they have some, a box of sheet music. It's not often that you find medical sheet music, but it's a fun endeavor. Again, the thrill of the chase. I also started a collection, which we still have, that consists of books written for children about medicine. Mostly chapbooks of the 19th, maybe the late 18th century, like what happens when you go to the doctor or you go to the dentist, that type of thing. One day maybe I will sell them, it just depends. Who knows? Anyway, my main focus is to find books, both, the great books, the important books in medicine, and just as important, those in-between books, books that were written in between the great books that kind of chart the progress of that medical or that specialty. And they may not be as well known, to people that know something about history of medicine, but they are nonetheless important. As an example, a lot of history of medicine collections have books on vaccination. Well, after Jenner published his book, there were literally hundreds of small books and pamphlets that were published. And those are the important books, the important items, the treasures that make up a good collection, because that's what medical historians, people interested in the history of medicine want to look at. In the years that I've been out there buying and selling books and manuscripts, I've ultimately come to know and understand value, which is really the main part of my job, and of course why I'm down here in Galveston. It's being able to place a value on a particular book. One of the questions I get asked all the time is, well, what makes a book rare and valuable? The age alone of a book is only one factor of many that may make a book valuable. I mean, you can find a book, for instance, that was printed in 1502, let's say, all right? Over 500 years ago. And it may have very little or no value because it's a later, like the 8th or 9th edition of somebody's comments on somebody else's religious views. Very boring, very unimportant. On the other hand, you might have something published in the 20th century, such as the first announcement of the discovery of DNA by Crick and Watson, published in a very small number of pamphlets for a specific conference. Those are worth about $20,000 unsigned. Signed, they're probably worth double now. So age, again, is only one of the factors that is taken into consideration in figuring out value. Other factors include provenance. Example, I had a book, a general history book, that really was not very interesting. I don't even remember if it was a first edition or not. But it came from the library of Sir Isaac Newton, who signed it twice. So just that provenance created the value in the book. Other factors include the importance of the book, and that's especially true in the sciences, the importance of the book in the field. Also edition, the edition of the book. Now you might think it's got to be a first edition to be valuable, but not necessarily true. Sometimes a later edition becomes as important or even more important. Look, a Darwin collector is going to want to get the first edition, the first American edition, 4th issue, of course, the 3rd edition, and the 6th edition of The Origin of Species. Why? Because those are the editions in which Darwin made significant changes in the text during his lifetime. So addition, and of course the condition of the book is also important. So anyway, as I say, my expertise in valuing books is the reason I'm here in Galveston. I have been asked to appraise the library. Now, I don't know how many of you have actually been up to the 4th floor in the Moody Medical Library to the Blocker collection in the history of medicine. But I can tell you that that is truly where the treasures here are. The Blocker collection not only has a significant percentage of the great books in medicine, but also a great number of those in-between books that are so important if you have any interest or are researching the history of medicine. So what I'm here to do tonight is to kind of take you through a little tour of some, just the tip of the iceberg of some of those treasures. But before I do that, before I show you the pictures, I want to say a word about rare book collecting in general. I mean, why collect rare books and manuscripts? Students certainly have no time for the history of medicine, right? I mean, it's got to be enough just to get through school. Books, in my opinion, are really a summary of our culture, of our progress as rational beings. For us, books are the links, an intimate connection between past and present. Books tell the story of both the outside world and of inside our hearts. And though nations may come and go and civilizations may die out, the records that we have kept have and will continue to live on. Our present is built on a foundation of the past, and books are those records that make up that foundation. Now, medicine in particular is an excellent example. Medical history was the first of the humanistic disciplines to enter medical education directly. As a former librarian here once said, collections like the one at the Moody Medical Library provide palpable contact with the medical past. They are essential if a medical school is to sustain that sense of continuity, without which a profession becomes rootless, unsure of its identity, and unsure of its present and future mission. Books have been revered by the ancients just as they are today. The words of the great medical writers such as Hippocrates and Galen have been translated and expanded and commented on many, many times over the centuries. In fact, these words, the words of these great medical writers, form the basis of the research done to make changes to our knowledge and our technology. And why collect books in Galveston? I mean, there are lots of great history of medicine collections in the country. The National Library of Medicine in Washington, College of Physicians in Philadelphia, the Wangenstein Library at the University of Minnesota, UCLA, all great medical collections. So why in Texas? The answer is medicine happens here. Okay? Again, let me quote from a past librarian here. What the Blocker collection does so admirably is provide a visible presence for medical history through the source of that history, some rare, some old, some contemporary, and some regional. Smaller collections of high quality have a special place in medical education and in the sustenance of medical history. They complement and supplement the great collections. Properly built, such collections can truly be great on their own terms. Look, the great historical collections will, and for the most part, continue to be expanded and to excel. But just as important at the local level, like here in Galveston, are the archives, the letters, the manuscripts, the photographs of a school's faculty, and the practitioners in the area. You are serving both the historian of medicine who will come to Galveston because of the great books you have, as well as those interested in the history of medicine of the region. These collections are absolutely essential to creating the entire historical picture of the growth of this area. I mean, look at the history of Galveston. You know, though it's not necessarily, proper for me to tell you about the history of your city. But I did a little research, okay? The first printer in the state of Texas set up his printing press here in Galveston in 1815. Okay, in 1870, Galveston was the largest city in Texas with nearly 19,000 people living here. Did you know that you had the first structure to use electric lighting? You had the first telephone service. The first baseball game was played here in the state. How's that? And the first continuous daily newspaper was founded right here in the 1840s. And it's here where the University of Texas decided to put its medical school, okay? And that's why the history of medicine should be here in Galveston, okay? It reflects the growth of the school, medical education, and the practice in this region. And it's why you have special collections here at UTMB. And while we're on the topic of collecting rare books in the history of medicine, we should put in a word about current technology. A key factor in any collection, especially in special collections, but as any librarian will tell you, is how and whether the collections are used. Students, like I mentioned, they're on their computers. I mean, if it is not online, it either doesn't exist or it's not important, okay? And what about digitizing? Okay, that's the new keyword of any and every library there is. Digitizing this and digitizing that. I mean, there's gloom and doom reports of what is coming. Digital universities. Students don't even have to, leave their rooms because everything is on the computer. When the University of California opened its last campus at Merced a few years ago, I called up the head librarian just to introduce myself, and he quickly said, oh, no. No special collections. In fact, we're going to have a virtual library, he called it. Okay, a virtual library. Now, digitization, of course, does exist. It is important. There's no denying that. I mean, access, for purposes of access especially, it is important. But I want to show you something, and I'm going to go to that first slide. Now, this is a manuscript. It is the oldest item in the Blocker History of Medicine collection. It is called the Rosa Medica, and it is a 14th century manuscript. This is the basis of what is thought to be the first printed medical book by an English author. It was first printed in 1480. It was originally compiled around 1314. It is broken down into 5 parts: fevers, injuries, hygiene, diet, and drugs. It contains references to early medical greats such as Avicenna, Galen, and Dioscorides. It is essentially a compilation of the theories of these early medical authorities with the addition of some charms and some folk medicine and some original observations of the author. In fact, the author of this book, John of Gaddesden, is thought to be the model for the disreputable Dr. Physic in the Canterbury Tales. Okay? Anyway, this is the manuscript. Now, if you needed to access the manuscript digitally, this is what you'd see. Like this. All right? This is the real thing. Now, look at this. Look at the binding. I'm going to show you the first page, just the first page. You don't get this looking at the digital image, okay? The annotations. You don't get the sense of the rubrication. You don't get the smell of the binding, okay? It's an overall tactile feeling, all right? Now again, I don't deny the importance of digitizing material, especially things like this, which is unique, all right? But you can see the difference here, all right, between what you see on the computer and holding this in your hands, all right? Nothing like that. Now, so you see, not only does the Blocker collection have this 14th century manuscript, it also has the printed book. Now, this is not a first edition, which I mentioned was printed in 1480. This is printed in 1500 in Venice. It is, or sorry, 1502. They changed the name of the title of it from Rosa Medica to Rosa Anglica. And as you can see, this is the title page, all of the annotations, part of which, I mean, that's what makes a lot of these books so amazing, are the annotations, because it's not just the text that you come to read. If you're really studying and you're really interested in the history of medicine, it's also the annotations, because that is what whoever was reading it at the time was thinking. So not only do you get the text, but you get it in context of who was reading it and what they were writing. And these annotations are contemporary to the book. So these were probably written in the early 16th century. Okay. So before I start again, let me just finish. As Brett told you, I practiced law for 15 years. I learned a long time ago that everything that we do and everything we learn is based on history, on some aspect of history. In law school, it was based on cases. What we did in law school was we read cases that were printed throughout history, all right? And it's these cases that judges use to make their decisions. A set of facts, and the judges will use precedent, cases over the centuries to make their decisions. The same thing in law school. We learned how to analyze a set of facts based upon precedent or historical law. All right, it's the same thing with medicine. In medicine, you know, things were figured out hundreds of years ago. Because of dissections, we pretty much knew the anatomy of the human being a long time ago. So what's changed, obviously, is the technology. But it's the building of that knowledge, okay, from what has come before, from your teachers and from your teachers' teachers, just like the law, all right? And that's what you find in the books. Now, the main difference between law and the history of law and medicine and the history of medicine is you have much better pictures. So let me show you what I mean, a little bit about this. And I don't know if you want to dim the lights a little bit, if it makes it easier to see, but I'm going to show you a few of the books. Okay, now this book is printed in Venice, 1486. It's the Liber Canonis by Avicenna. It is one of the earliest translations of an Arabic medical text to the Western world. The canon of medicine follows in the footsteps of Hippocrates and Galen, which many of the early books do. They took the words of the early medical authorities and basically gave their comments. Avicenna here attributes diseases to imbalances of the four humors, which are the four bodily fluids, or to factors of the psyche, as well as to physical causes. This canon of medicine was written in 1012 AD, all right? So keep in mind, this is one of the earliest printed medical books. Originally written in 1012 AD, printed in 1482. As early as this, okay, Avicenna was classifying and describing diseases such as diabetes, as well as diseases of the brain, including tumors. In this book, he proposes causes for diseases, for example, suggesting that tuberculosis is contagious. He also outlines treatments for diseases and the methods of hygiene. Avicenna was the first physician to observe the communicability of diseases such as dysentery, the spread of diseases through water, the properties and preparation of alcohol and sulfuric acid, the genetic nature of certain conditions, and the sweet taste of urine in those with diabetes. Okay, the next book is probably one in which you've seen this image before. It is Ketham's Fasciculus Medicinae, Venice 1500. This is not a first edition. It was first printed in 1491, also in Venice. But this book has the distinction of being the first printed collection of anatomical illustrations of any kind. Now, like Avicenna, this book was originally written many centuries before, and it was actually circulated in manuscript form as early as the 13th century. The woodcuts, as you can see here, are dramatic and realistic. This is another illustration from the book. As you can see the gentleman sitting in the chair overseeing the dissection. It is believed to be the origin of the term chairman of the department. And they're doing a dissection. Now, just so you know, by the mid-16th century in Great Britain, British physicians were allowed to demonstrate anatomy with the dissected cadavers of 4 executed prisoners each year. That was their limit. Okay, the next slide, let me get this one. The next slide we have is Guido Guicci's Surgery, printed in Paris, 1544. Now, this was printed 1 year after Vesalius, which I'll explain next. But Guido Guicci is an Italian physician practicing in Paris, and this is an outstanding contribution to the literature of surgery. It's a very large, oversized volume that has been called the most beautiful textbook of surgery printed in the 16th century. It's got woodcut illustrations that have never been equaled in the field. The text begins with the writings of Hippocrates, as I said, like many of these early books, discusses ulcers and wounds of the head, and continues with Guicci's commentary on Galen's work on fractures and joints. The large, clear woodcuts reconstruct ancient apparatus, such as this and this, showing a surgeon and his assistants reducing a dislocated shoulder, straightening a curved vertebral column on a special bed, and many similar. You can see the interesting ways that they practiced medicine back then. All right, the next book is of course, the most famous, the most classic book in the history of medicine, Vesalius's De Humani Corporis Fabrica, printed in Basel, first edition, 1543. It is a book of revolutionary moment in anatomy and surgery in a format surpassed by no other scientific treatise. Vesalius was 28 years old when he printed the book. He derived accurate information on the body's structure and the function of its parts from dissections that he actually conducted. The Fabrica is one of the most beautiful printed works of its time. It's remarkable for its series of magnificent plates, which set new technical standards of anatomical illustration and indeed of book illustration in general. Let's see, there's the man himself. And again, you can see at the top and at the bottom, the contemporary, annotations contemporary to the book. So whoever was reading this at the time, I mean, it must have been somewhat new at the time, they made these annotations. That's him. These are the very famous woodcut illustrations of the Muscle Man. If you look, you can see the background, which is a beautiful woodcut of, I think, Pavia, somewhere in Italy. And actually, if you put all of these together, they form a complete, actually a circle, I think, picture of the background. And one more, as you can see. This book has been translated, reissued, copied, and plagiarized over and over again, and its illustrations have been used or copied in other medical works all the way to the end of the 18th century. This, I mean, you just can't say enough about Vesalius. Vesalius, okay, this book is like the crown, the jewel in the crown, all right? It was so expensive at the time that it was published in 1543 that even Vesalius' students could not afford it. That is why there's a lot of copies around. I mean, of the 500 or so copies printed, most of them still exist. Okay, next, Perret. Ambrose Perret, La Méthode curative des plaies, Paris, 1561. It is the first and only separate edition of Perret's work on head wounds, and it is written, this is a good story, it was written in response to an inquiry after the death of Henry II. Henry II was struck in the eye by a shaft of a lance at a tournament in celebration of the marriage of Philip, the King of Spain, with Elizabeth of France. And so Perret wrote this book on head wounds. After Henry II died, Perret was able to retain his position as surgeon in ordinary under Francois II, who was the second son of Catherine of Medici. This work discusses the anatomy of the head, the surgery of head wounds with special attention to skull fractures, and treatment of diseases of all organs of the face. First editions of Perret's work are very rare, and they are very, very, very expensive. And you got them. And you have a few of them. The next book is, now I know it's not a very sexy picture, but this is the title page of Fracastoro's Syphilis Sive Morbus Gallicus, printed Venice, 1550. It is the first edition of the most famous poem in medical literature. Apart from being the first work to illustrate the contemporary facts of the French disease, it was the first to recognize the cause and the first to coin the name syphilis. When the disease swept through Europe during the Renaissance, Fracastoro composed this mock heroic Latin poem describing an imaginary shepherd named Syphilis, how he contracted the pox, and his treatment with mercury. Interesting, because by the time this book was printed in 1530, mercury was pretty much on the way out as being used in any treatment because of the side effects. It was replaced by, I think it's guaiacum, which is the sacred wood of the American Indian. But in any event, the disease took the name of the hero of the poem, and that is how we know it nowadays. Okay, now on to the real piece de resistance, and that is Harvey's De Motu Cordis, published in Frankfurt in 1628. This book, ladies and gentlemen, is considered the most important single medical work ever published. It is very rare. It is in this book that William Harvey announced his discovery of the circulation of the blood and gave a clear description and experimental proof of the heart's action. The introduction records some of the manifest errors of current teaching on the arteries, on pulmonary circulation, on heart structure, and goes on to describe the heart's movement and function, together with experimental evidence that was derived from Harvey's dissection of mollusks and of insects and cold-blooded animals, where he could see the heart motion kind of in slower motion. Harvey also reported on the heart muscle's ability to recover from fatigue here. There's only 2 illustrations in the book, which actually reproduce 4 of the figures of the veins in the forearm from an earlier work by Fabricius. Now, let me just say a word here about rarity. It's very interesting. Like I said, on the, with the Vesalius, that book was so expensive that all of the copies are basically, I mean, for the most part, still exist. Interestingly enough, Vesalius, because his students could not afford the Fabrica, at the same time published a smaller version of it called the Epitome. And that was for his students. And the Epitome included one very important illustration that actually was never in the Fabrica. But that book is much more scarce, all right, because it was used, all right? And then, you know, it's just used over the years. So now the Harvey was printed in, not only printed in a small number, but it was printed on really crummy paper. And so those copies that do still exist, and there's only a handful, for the most part are very brittle, and it's almost like you can't touch them because they'll crumble. It just so happens, and I've seen maybe 3, 4, 5, maybe a half a dozen copies in my life. The University of Texas Medical Branch's copy is by far the best copy I've ever seen. You can actually, I mean, you can actually hold it. It is nowhere near crumbling. It is nowhere near brittle. And it's just an amazing, it's a wonder to have this book here at this institution. You should be very proud. Okay, the next book. Richard Lower's Tractatus de Corde, Amsterdam, 1669, published the same year that the London edition of 1669, which is thought of as the first edition. This book is interesting. It records Richard Lower's concept of the heart muscle and his explanation of the heartbeat as a muscular mechanism. He also describes the change in color of the blood from dark to bright as it passes through the lungs. Now, Lower, I'll show you another picture. Lower was part of a group of young Oxford scientists that was led by Robert Boyle and Thomas Willis, which ultimately became the Royal Society. Lower was interesting because he was the first person to effect a blood transfusion from one animal to another. All right, and that was in 1665. It was 2 years later in Paris that J.B. Dennis actually performed the first human blood transaction. Okay, that's Lower. The next book is one of my favorites. It's Bidlew's Anatomia Humana Corporis, published in Amsterdam, 1685. Bidlew's work is one of the most beautiful and exciting anatomical atlases. It has 105 large and stunning copper plate engravings. This work is also interesting for generating one of the most famous controversies in the history of medicine. Here are some of the other illustrations. The original plates for this book, okay, happened to find their way into another famous writer, William Calpers' work on anatomy, published in 1698. They got there because Calper was able to purchase the plates from the publisher, and he reissued them under his own name. Well, that obviously resulted in the plagiarism lawsuit. Now, Bidlew, I mean, a lot of these physicians became famous because they wrote the books, and Bidlew is a good example. He became William of Orange's personal physician and accompanied him to England when he came over in 1688. Okay, next book. Oops, let's go back. Now this is a great discovery. When I was here last time, we were going through books, and I found this book, which is Benjamin Franklin's Experiments and Observations on Electricity, published London, 1769. It is not a first edition. It was first printed in 1751. That first edition, by the way, is very, very rare. A copy went up for auction last year and brought $40,000, so it's rare. Anyway, this is Franklin's most important scientific publication. His findings in this book resulted in the proposition of the single fluid theory of electricity, which provided an explanation of induced charges. And it includes his very famous account of his experiment with the kite and the key, okay? But what's really interesting about this book is, as you can see at the top, some handwriting up there, okay? Now, it says, a present for Mr. Alexander Small. And under the word experiments, it says to Mr. Daniel Mcneil, and is dated 1780. Now, Alexander Small happens to have been a friend and a longtime correspondent of Franklin, and a likely recipient of this book from him, all right? Daniel Mcneil, I think, because we did some research on it, was probably the captain of a ship out of Boston who actually came into a French port and ended up having a short correspondence with Franklin. Now, both of these inscriptions are in the same hand. So, on the one hand, it's a little bit unusual to have had Franklin give the book to Small and then give the book to Mcneil. But stranger things have happened, and nobody knew about this. Nobody recognized the fact that this book had this inscription in it. It is not 100%, with 100% authority, Franklin's signature, but I would say that it is definitely likely. So that was quite a find. Okay. Next, we have Edward Jenner's Inquiry into the Causes and Effects of the Varioli Vaccine, London, 1798. First edition of a milestone in the history of medicine. Jenner established the fact that a vaccination or inoculation with vaccinia, which is cowpox lymph matter, protects against smallpox. This work, which describes 23 successful vaccinations, announced to the world one of the greatest triumphs in the history of medicine. His discovery of vaccination made possible the immediate control of smallpox, and basically, he was the founder of the science of immunology. Just can't say enough. I mean, it's just one of the great books in the history of medicine. The next work is not very sexy either, but it is the title page. It's actually the top wrapper of the first edition of the first report of the discovery of X-rays. William Röntgen. It was published in two small pamphlets, one in 1895, the next year in 1896. Röntgen first suspected a new phenomenon while investigating the fluorescence produced near a Crookes tube. In late 1895, he immediately began a thorough set of experiments that revealed the uses of the new ray for science and medicine. Hundreds of articles and books on this new Röntgen rays, as they were called, were published in the years following their discoverer's announcement, and Röntgen was honored with being the first recipient of the Nobel Prize in Physics in 1901. These are the types of books I like, all right, because they generate controversy, all right, and controversy is a great thing. I mean, it makes history interesting. Literally, after Jenner's book was published, after Röntgen published his articles, I mean, there were pro and con. I mean, there's still, I mean, the argument on vaccination is still out. But these are the great books. These are the ones that the catalyst for all this other work that was done after. And I just can't say enough about them. Okay, I just now. I want to mention about the Pasteur collection. The Blocker collection in the history of medicine has a very rich and varied group of Pasteur items. It includes original manuscripts, autograph letters, portraits, sculptures, and first editions, including several items from Pasteur's own library. He, of course, wrote the epoch-making work detailing the discovery that partial heat sterilization kills microorganisms, causing spoilage. The work was undertaken at the request of the emperor in order to salvage the ailing national wine industry. Pasteur's research on fermentation and putrefaction led to his discovery of bacteria and then to the development of the germ theory of disease. Modern bacteriology and immunology are founded on Pasteur's research. Perhaps just as interesting, Pasteur wrote a classic work on the silkworm and its diseases. The result was one of the earliest studies and treatments of pathogenic germs. The Blocker collection contains not only the printed stuff, but these letters, manuscript letters, lectures. It contains a manuscript that has minutes of a report that Pasteur made of a projected founding of a scientific journal called the Annales Scientifiques de l'École Normale, which he actually ended up starting in 1864. Also, the microscope. This is Pasteur's own microscope. And if anybody's really interested in Pasteur, I highly recommend coming up to the Blocker collection because it is an unbelievably wonderful story, and there are just riches there from him. Continuing with manuscripts, they have the manuscript of the autobiography of Havelock Ellis. It was ultimately published in Boston in 1939 and entitled My Life. The manuscript version contains a number of variations from the actual published version, including an earlier version of the preface that eventually was published. Now, Havelock Ellis was an interesting guy. He studied medicine at St. Thomas's Hospital in London, but he never practiced. Instead, he devoted himself to the scientific study of sex. He was responsible for coining the term autoeroticism, and although a contemporary of Freud, he highly objected to Freud's application of adult sexual terms to infants. His increasing concern with sexual matters led to his monumental work, Studies in the Psychology of Sex, which appeared in 7 volumes over a period of 31 years. This is more of it. Ellis was also a great supporter of eugenics, serving as vice president of the Eugenics Education Society. So this is a bit, like I say, it's the tip of the iceberg of some of the great works. But like I said before, in addition to those works which are really well known, like the Vesalius and the Jenner, the Blocker collection also has those in-between works that are so important. And I'll give you a little sense of that. Being here in Galveston, I thought maybe we would talk a little bit about tropical diseases. Okay? This is the title page of William Piso's Historia Naturalis Brazil, published in Amsterdam, 1648. This was a pioneer work in tropical medicine within the larger context of a work on the natural history of Brazil. This book, which is a nice large folio, is bound with Jacob de Bont's De Medicina Indorum, published in Leiden in 1642. De Bont was the first to regard tropical medicine as an independent branch of medical science. It is the first Dutch work on tropical medicine and the first modern description of beriberi and cholera. John Disternell was an American map maker by trade, but he wrote this book called Influence of Climate in North and South America, published in New York in 1867. In this book, he discusses how changes in climate not only affect the health of a population of a specific location, but other things that could affect it, like the agricultural output, specific diseases that occur in specific regions, things like purity of the water. He uses statistics, as is often the case with researching diseases, to reflect how climate influences diseases, how it influences health and health regimens. This is the title page of a very important work by James Tytler entitled A Treatise on the Plague and Yellow Fever, published in Salem, Massachusetts in 1799. It is the first edition of a distinctive comparison between these two devastating infectious diseases that appeared in the United States between 1793 through 1799. The book is divided into 3 parts. The first is a full account of the Asiatic or true plague. The second, an exhaustive treatise on yellow fever with some remarkable cases. And the last is a rather large appendix which includes queries and opinions of major writers on the subject. He includes in the appendix histories of the Athens, the Constantinople, and the London plagues. This is the title page of James Lynn's work called An Essay on Diseases Incidental in Europeans in Hot Climates, published in London, 1768. Now, of course, James Lynn was much better known for his major work on scurvy. But this book is an important step in the progress of tropical medicine. In it, he nearly completes the link between malaria and mosquitoes. Now, okay, so these, keep in mind, these all come from the Blocker. I chose these books 2 days ago just to show you. I mean, just off the top. Now, this is the first American edition of James Lynn's book. Same book, but why? And if you recall, I talked a little bit about editions and how the first edition may not be the most important edition. This is important because it's the first appearance of 2 parts that were added onto the book in the end. The first is a section on intermittent fevers, which was important to the topic of tropical medicine. And the second is a short article entitled A Simple and Easy Way to Render Seawater Fresh and to Prevent a Scarcity of Provisions in Long Voyages at Sea. So again, it's important, to know, the difference between the editions and what changes were made and what additions were put in. This is Benjamin Rush's An Account of the Bilious Remitting Yellow Fever, published in Philadelphia, 1794. It is one of the many works on the yellow fever epidemic in Philadelphia in 1793. Rush's description of the epidemic is classic, not only for his thorough discussion of the disease, but because it describes his work in treating the sick during the epidemic and in proposing measures to prevent a recurrence. Now, coming closer to home, see, unfortunately, none of these books in tropical medicine, as I figured out a little too late, have great pictures, but, well, we're trying. This is a picture from a book by Greensville Dowell entitled Yellow Fever and Malarial Diseases, published in Philadelphia, 1876. Dowell, who was an authority on yellow fever, was really considered the first to direct attention to the fact that yellow fever is transmitted by mosquitoes. After practicing for a short time in Memphis, Dowell moved to Texas in 1853. He served as a surgeon for the Confederacy during the Civil War. In July of 1865, he was part of a group that formed the Galveston Medical Society. And at the same time, he was planning the creation of a professional journal. And in January of 1866, the first issue of the Galveston Medical Journal was published. In 1867, Dowell became a professor of anatomy and then dean of the medical school here, which I think was called Seoul University. Is that right? Yeah. Okay.